Hello, everyone coming in. Give it just a minute while we kind of fill in. Oh, we have a bunch of people. I'm not going to start just yet. We're going to give it a little bit of time for everyone to kind of come in, but welcome to our Tomato 101 webinar. So if you're looking to grow tomatoes, you're in the right place. Give it just a minute. I hope everyone is doing well on this nice Sunday or Saturday. It's really sunny outside. I'm excited to go out and do some planting. But I haven't chosen my tomato yet. I'm hoping to learn today. All right. I hope my lighting's okay. I had the sun flaring on the side of my face for a while, but all righty. All right, and if anyone is looking around, you're probably going to find your Q&A section. So I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Yes, we're going to be talking lots about tomatoes. All right, we are at about 10 o'clock and it looks like many of you have joined. Thank you for coming and thank you for participating in this. My name is Taylor. I work at Slope Garden Center. I'm the assistant manager at our Slope Boulevard store right by the zoo. And today, Dan Alexander is going to be doing a talk on tomatoes. He works at our Mill Valley store in Miller Avenue and has so much knowledge about vegetables. It's always great talking with him, and his webinars have been doing very well. And so I'm happy to have him back. But really, I just wanted to kind of welcome everyone here. I wanted to let you know that you probably already saw it as you were coming in, but there is a poll that is about where you're located, if you've been growing tomatoes, or if you attended these webinars before. It's really appreciated if you can answer those questions. We're gonna kind of get a little live update on where everyone is, so we have a better idea of how to kind of suit our needs for different places, because everywhere is a microclimate and everywhere grows plants a little bit differently. So tomatoes are no exception, and there's many tomatoes that grow really well in some places and then some that grow really well in some other ones. So yeah, I see a few people even answering me. Another thing that you will probably have received already in the reminder email is you have a link to our resource handout. So we have lots of information and resources that you can use to learn about growing tomatoes, and also like lemons and roses and all the really fun kind of stuff to grow, and even some that you don't really know about or are really going to be soon interested in growing in your garden. So lots of fun information there. We also have this cool online shopping list. So Dan's going to be talking about so many cool products that we have in our store that are really helpful for growing these tomatoes in like the right way, organic ways, or in the proper like more environmental ways. So check out the shopping list. He's going to be talking about a lot of those products in his webinar. So you can use that as a reference when you go into the stores. Also, there should be an outline there. So if you want to kind of follow along or look back at it later and just kind of be reminded about what he talked about, there should be an outline there. And so hopefully all that information is sent to you and on your reminder email. And if not, we can always get to some more, we can get you some more information if you contact us later. There is going to be a survey probably tomorrow or when you get another email about just, hey, how is the webinar? And also some really good questions about maybe timings for future seminars and webinars going into summer. We are looking into possibly changing our time because on weekdays or on weekends can be kind of difficult for some people going into summertime. So we want to look at all the different options of timelines for people to have this webinar available to them. So if you have some information there, check out our emails coming soon to kind of fill out those surveys. And that'd be awesome. As well as we have some upcoming webinars. We're going to definitely go into them a little bit more at the very end to remind you, but we have some really good beneficial insect webinars coming up in next week, and some native pollinator webinar coming in the week after that. So if you're interested in insects or interested in how they affect your garden and the good ones and the bad ones, all that kind of information, it's a great resource coming up in the coming 2 weeks. So I think we're about at a good time. We have a lot of people attending. So I'm going to be turning this over to Dan Alexander. He's at our Mill Valley kind of location with all of his fun planting needs and all the tomatoes and flowers all around him. So I hope you enjoy. I'll be answering questions in the chat as well as gathering the questions as you bring them in to give to him later on in the webinar. Most of them are going to be answered near the end. So if you have a few questions that he didn't answer just yet, I'll see them in the chat and I'll try and gather a few of them so he can have those questions later on. But thank you, Dan, and have a good day.
Thank you, Taylor. And a shout out to Jen of our design department, who is behind the camera and whose studio we're using here. And I'm Dan Alexander. I'm on staff at the Miller Avenue, Mill Valley Sloat. And there are people like me at each of the sloats who can help you with your particular area, your microclimates, the plants that grow best in your areas. I'm going to try to make this fairly general so that it applies to all of us. I'm sorry I can't see you all out there, but it's certainly enjoyable to talk with you. The tomato is an obsession for many people, and a joy and a frustration for many of us. I think we develop a love-hate relationship with it because, as tasty and wonderful as it is, it's not the easiest plant to grow. And especially in the Bay Area, it has a lot of challenges. Tomatoes are a tropical plant, originated in South America, we think, was developed into the edible plant that we use in Mexico in pre-Columbian times, discovered by the Spanish when they conquered Mexico, and then as the trade winds blew, taken to the Philippines, where it went to Asia, and then around the Horn of Africa to Europe. And along with many of the other New World foods that we enjoy so much, that include potatoes and peppers and corn, tomatoes are closely related to the potatoes and the peppers. That means that they have commonalities with them, which unfortunately include a lot of diseases, and that's partly what makes them tricky. And the other thing that makes them tricky is that we in the Bay Area have a wonderful long growing season, but we have cold nights. And we have cold nights generally for most of the Bay Area throughout the summer. A cold night in this case is defined as a night under 55 degrees. And 55 degrees is about the temperature that tomatoes need to keep growing and keep ripening fruit. If the temperature drops below 55, they basically shut down and wait till the temperature gets up again before they start making sugars and ripening fruit again. And that's why for most of us, every evening, the tomatoes shut down, go to sleep, and then pick up again. That makes it tough. We tend not to have days that are too hot for tomatoes in most of the Bay Area. That would be extended periods above 85. But certainly in the East Bay, you have many days that are over 85. And that can be a different difficulty for the tomatoes and may require them to be shaded a little bit during those particularly hot periods. The wild progenitors of tomatoes have disappeared, so we don't know what the primordial tomato was like, unlike peppers, where we think we know the answer to that. And of course, with potatoes, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different potatoes in Peru. But we don't really know anything about the tomato before Columbus. And so we know that they were developed into relatively small fruits at that time. And a great deal of development has gone into them since, and particularly in modern times, with a better understanding of genetics. The developers and hybridizers have come up with tomatoes that can grow in many, many situations that probably the primordial tomato wouldn't have enjoyed at all. They are technically perennial plants, which means if they didn't get frozen or they didn't get diseased, they would live on from year to year. Here, they always freeze if we get the slightest frost, and most of them get diseased before the end of the summer and would not make it through the winter in that kind of weakened stage. They may make it through the summer season, but they won't survive through the winter. There are exceptions. My colleague Courtney was telling me she has a sun gold tomato that made it just fine through the last winter and is now putting out new growth, and it'll probably be a dandy plant. So it does happen. Tomatoes are naturally a vine, and they grow in the way where they would drape over other plants and then occasionally make contact with the ground again. And they have the ability to send out roots from the stems. And that way, the advantage is they can get more roots for a long vine. And if the vine gets broken, they have another spot that's rooted and can continue on. We can take advantage of that because the tomato stem can, in fact, make more roots than we see when we first get the tomato plant. This is a little baby, little Napoli tomato. It's a little bushy tomato with a small fruit. That's a relatively new one, a few years with us. But like all tomatoes, it has a whole bunch of little hairs all along the stems. And sometimes you can see little bumps in the stems that are near the leaf axils where the leaves come out of the stems. And those are all places that can become roots if they're covered with soil. So typically we plant tomatoes so that they'll be underground. The stem will be partly underground, and then it'll make more roots for the plant. And I'll show you how we do that in a few minutes. Where I'm going to plant a couple of tomatoes up, and as though we were doing it in a container or in the ground. We'll do it in a container here because we are on a cement floor. Now, I always ask the question, and it's a little more effective when we're in person, but I always ask the question, is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? And the answer turns out to be yes, as I put on the outline. It is a fruit or a vegetable. It's a fruit and a vegetable. Vegetable is not a technical term in botany, but fruit is. And vegetable might be a category like animal, vegetable, mineral. But vegetable doesn't have meaning in botany. Fruit has meaning, and it implies the covering for seeds. Seeds are the reproductive structure of flowering plants. They contain an embryo that grows into a new plant in the right circumstances. The covering for that is a protection for the seeds, and it's a method for distributing the seeds if it's designed to be eaten by a bird or an animal. Plants with small seeds like tomatoes and peppers probably were designed to be eaten by birds and then carried a distance and pooped out. And when they land with the poop, they have fertilizer built in right there, and away they go. In the case of the structure of a tomato, it's the swollen ovary. So the plant blooms, the seeds are held in an ovary behind the flower. The pollen pollinates the seeds in the ovary. The flower falls off. the ovary swells and becomes the structure that is then eaten by an animal or bird, and the seeds are carried off and planted. Many plants which we eat are this same structure. A zucchini is a fruit in that sense, in the same way that an apple is, or a banana, or a pear, or even the pod of an edible potted pea would be called a fruit botanically. So it's definitely a fruit any way you look at it. But of course, in normal parlance, we think of vegetables as being things that are less sweet usually, things we cook generally and maybe serve as a side dish. And so there is a confusion, which in the early 1900s caused a man who imported tomatoes to have to pay a bunch of import duty because it was declared that that was a fruit that he was importing, and the duties applied to fruits but not vegetables. He went all the way to the US Supreme Court and had the Supreme Court decide that although, yes, it's botanically a fruit, in our normal language, it's a vegetable. And so the tomato is officially, according to our Supreme Court, a vegetable, at least for import tax purposes. So enough of that. Let's get on to things that are important for you to decide how to select a tomato. You need to know some terms. One of the most important is days to ripen. Most of the time when you find a tomato plant in a nursery or wherever you buy tomato plants, it'll have a tag that will include information about days to harvest. And if not, it's something you can easily look up on your smartphone. Just put in tomato and the name of the variety, and usually you come up with a bunch of seed companies, and it'll tell you 70 days to harvest, for instance. The very earliest tomato that I've seen is one called 42 Day, and it supposedly ripens 42 days after planting a seedling of about this size. I will bet you dollars to donuts that it doesn't do it that fast here, but in perfect tomato country where the nights were above 55 and the days about 75, that's probably how fast it would mature. Most of the early tomatoes, like Early Girl or Beaver Lodge Slicer or Moskvich, are less than 70 days, and they'll say they're somewhere probably between 55 and 60 days. That's a very early tomato, and they're usually small, and very successful in the Bay Area. But they take longer than the days to harvest, say, on the tag, even here, because of the problem that I mentioned of the nights being cold. Every tomato is going to take longer than the published date. That means that when you get into some of the really big tomatoes, really big beefsteak type tomatoes, they may be as much as 90 days. That's 3 months. And that's in the best of conditions. And so you will be lucky to ripen a big beefsteak tomato in even 120 days, 4 months. And so what that really means is that you've got that much more time of exposure to possible bad influences, mainly fungi and insects, before you see the first tomatoes. So I highly recommend that everybody grow early tomatoes, mid tomatoes, and then if you want to experiment with some late tomatoes, do that, but don't make that your main crop. The other two terms that are critical are determinate and indeterminate. And I don't know any easy way to remember what the difference means, except that indeterminate means unknown. And what they're talking about there is really the height and growth of the tomato plant. An indeterminate tomato, it grows like a vine and just keeps growing. It'll make side branches and they'll just keep growing. All the plant will just keep growing. It'll keep flowering. It'll keep setting fruit as long as the conditions are right for it. A determinate tomato is one that tops out and it branches naturally like a little tree and makes its fruit, a big crop of its fruit all at once. And then it'll continue to make smaller amounts of fruit through the season. This is an ace tomato, and it's cheating a little bit here because there are actually two in this can. So it makes it look bushier than it really is. But if you look at it from this direction, you're seeing pretty much how it grows, and you can see that it's compact, stumpy, and it's already starting to make flowers here at the top. They're hard, you won't be able to see them, they're green buds, but it is making flowers here. And Ace is one of the old line determinate tomatoes that people have grown for years and years. Sometimes it's called Ace 55. I believe it's a hybrid, although it's hard to get information about some of these older tomatoes. If it's a hybrid, then it runs into another term we throw around a lot, which is heirloom. If it's a hybrid, it cannot be an heirloom. An heirloom is defined as what we call an open pollinated tomato that's more than 50 years old. That doesn't mean the plant's 50 years old, but the type has been available in seed form for 50 years or more. That's a pretty stern limitation. And there are a lot of tomatoes that are heirlooms, but there are a lot more that aren't, mainly because they've been developed in the last, say, 30 years. And by definition, they can't be an heirloom then. But some of the best known heirlooms would be Brandywine, Cherokee Purple, Black Krim, which are wonderful tomatoes, but they, being heirlooms, they generally don't have the characteristics that market farmers need to grow huge numbers of them and ship them successfully to the markets. So you'll find them in the farmers markets, you'll find them maybe in the special bin at the market these days that says heirloom tomatoes, you know, $12.99 a pound or whatever. You will find some there. Unfortunately, they're usually not labeled, so you can't tell what variety they are. Although you can recognize some of them. The green and yellow striped ones are probably green zebras. The ones that are big like this and purple on top are probably Cherokee purples. And those are the tomatoes which people can save seeds from and then grow them again the next year and have them be the same tomato year after year, so long as you don't have a ton of other tomatoes around that could cross with them and make a different cross. The term open pollinated simply means that they're allowed to pollinate themselves. A hybrid will have a hand cross where the developer will take pollen from this plant and add it to the flower of this plant in order to get a particular cross. Early Girl is probably an excellent example of that because Early Girl was developed and then the cross is held secret after that, so that not everybody can make an Early Girl tomato. And then the cross was sold to Monsanto, and that upset some people because because not everybody likes Monsanto. And then people started developing tomatoes that would be like Early Girl, but they couldn't call them Early Girl. The way you do that is you simply take seeds from Early Girl, grow them up, see which ones are most like Early Girl, take those seeds, grow them up, keep doing that through generation after generation until you have a fairly stable plant of your own that you can grow in an open pollinated way. It takes many generations and a lot of hard work. We have had in here a tomato called Dirty Girl, which is grown by Dirty Girl Farms down south of Santa Cruz. And it was developed in that way, and specifically as an alternative to Early Girl. There's also one called New Girl, which is quite similar, and an early slicing tomato like Early Girl, but it would not have the hybrid vigor that an Early Girl would have. An open pollinated heirloom is not going to have what we call hybrid vigor, which comes from the cross-pollination and the fact that there are more genes in the pool, and the tomato is able to adapt a little better to different circumstances that way. Organic or conventional? Organic means certified organic. It means that somebody has gone through the effort to have all of their ingredients certified by one of the outside organizations who will say, yes, this comes from a natural source. It is not a chemical creation. Organic inputs have to be non-chemically altered. So that doesn't mean they can't be chemicals. There are lots of chemicals that come out of the ground very naturally, but you can't alter those chemicals and then have them certified as organic ingredients. That tells you sort of what's in the mix, and it tells you that they haven't used pesticides on them other than organically available pesticides like soaps. Oils are certified for organic use, and organic growers can use those. At the farmer's market, you'll often see plants that are labeled, or fruit that's labeled no spray. And I think what they're trying to imply is they have grown them by organic methods, but they haven't wanted to spend the money to get certified organic because it's quite an expensive process. But unless they're certified organic, you don't really know what it means, how they've grown things. The other advantage to organic plants, by the way, this is my personal soapbox, but it implies that the farmer is using methods that are superior for the soil, superior for the surrounding environment. They are not coming over with airplanes and spraying the entire area with pesticides or herbicides. And to me, that's good husbandry and something we should support. And so buying organic starts, organic flowers, supports our organic farmers. Now, tomatoes have some particular needs. They need about 6 hours of sun a day. More is okay, but that 6 hours between 10 a.m. and about 4 p.m. is when the sun is high and the energy is strong. And they need that energy for their leaves to photosynthesize the sugars, proteins that they need for growth and for ripening the fruit. It takes a large amount of sugar to make a tomato sweet. And it takes a lot of other chemicals to make them red, to give them the acidity that balances the sugars and makes them interesting to eat, and chemicals to make the stems strong and to make lots of growth. So that takes a lot of energy, and you can't successfully grow tomatoes in the shade. That's all there is to it. So 6 hours of sun, and then a temperature range that, as I mentioned, between 55 and 75 is ideal. They will grow outside of that range. They won't grow well below 45 degrees at all. And they won't grow well above about 90 or 95. So there is a range. They also need decent drainage. It doesn't have to be fabulous. I once made the mistake of planting a tomato in a plastic bag, a bag of soil, basically, like this. It wasn't a mistake to plant it in the bag, but I made the mistake of not punching holes in the bag for drainage. And a few weeks later, I came by and realized the plant was basically sitting in a sludge of rather foul-smelling potting soil. But the plant was doing fabulously. And so I realized that they do not absolutely require perfect drainage. I did then punch holes in it, and the plant went on to lead a wonderful life and give us lots of tomatoes. They need some room to grow, and the bag of soil is a good visual for how much room they need to grow. Is this on camera?
Yeah.
This is a 1 cubic foot bag of compost, and this is about half as much soil as you need to successfully grow a tomato in a container. So rule of thumb, 2 cubic feet of soil for a container grown full-size tomato to get it through the entire season. If you put it in a smaller pot, it'll grow for a while, and then it'll stall about halfway through the season and start producing less and less and stop growing. Can we see that can that's on the ground over there?
I can do that.
Can pan over there?
Yeah.
This is a 15-gallon container, and earlier today I put 90% of this bag, 2 cubic foot bag of slow organic potting soil into it. So that's just about the right size for 1 tomato plant. A half barrel, for instance, is 4 cubic feet, a wine barrel, half wine barrel. And you could potentially grow 2 tomato plants in a half wine barrel. If you want to grow tomatoes in a smaller container, you can do it, but you should choose determinate varieties like this Ace here, or the little Napoli that I had out earlier. And there are others that are excellent. There's Bush Early Girl, and there's Bush Champion, and there's Bush Beefsteak. Any tomato that has the word Bush in it is going to be a determinate tomato. That's kind of the tip-off. But there aren't all that many. The Roma, all of the Roma type tomatoes are determinate. So Roma, San Marzano, Amish paste, any of those paste tomatoes are going to be determinate and will do fine in containers as well. There's also a little tomato called Patio, which was developed specifically to be compact and to grow in containers, and tops out at about that height and makes lots of nice little, slightly larger than cherry tomatoes. I want to disabuse you all of the term sucker on tomatoes. A sucker usually refers to things that grow up from the roots of plants, or sometimes on citrus you get what are called water suckers that come off of branches that are these wild pieces of growth that come up on a citrus tree. Tomatoes don't really have suckers at all. What they have is branches. Every leaf axil, where the leaf comes out of the stem, has a bud. And every one of those buds at some point in the tomato's life is going to start to grow and become a branch. There is a piece of common wisdom out there which says pinch off the suckers that are below the first flowers. I have never understood the reason for that. I think there is some sense that the so-called suckers are draining the energy out of the plant, or nothing could be further from the truth. They are in fact making leaves, which are necessary for the fruit, for the plant to produce the energy that it needs to support the rest of the plant. So I highly discourage people picking off the suckers, the branches, unless there's a good reason to do it. And there are a few good reasons to do it. One is that you may want the plant to be off the ground enough that branches aren't touching the ground. And so some of the low suckers or branches can be pinched off so that the plant's elevated. And it may get too many of them so that you just can't manage it. The plant has too many branches winding around each other and they're shading out the inside of the plant. And so you want to thin it out the way you would any fruit tree to let more light and air into the plant. But just as a routine thing to say all suckers come off below the first flowers, I think is nonsense. And so that's my 2 cents worth on that. Similarly, for pinching off the flowers, on some plants, like a bell pepper, you're well advised to pinch off the first fruit or two that start to develop so that the plant doesn't just make 1 or 2 giant fruits and that's the end of it. But on tomatoes, these first flowers, and there's some right here at the top of this Herb de Cani, a nice Eastern European variety. It's making flowers already, and there's no reason to pinch those off. It's going to continue to grow, even though these flowers are here. This is an early variety, and you want early flowers. You want flowers that are going to make fruit, and why buy an early variety if you're not going to let it make fruit for you early? It does not make the plant stronger in the long run to pinch off the flowers. You can do that on one plant and not do it on another, the same variety, and let them grow. And in 6 weeks, they're going to be exactly the same. So I say, go for the early fruit. Let's see. Although there are many microclimates in the Bay Area, we do all have the cold nights. And I just, on my phone, I put Danville on to take a microclimate, or at least a general climate that's quite different from over here in Mill Valley. And I noticed that their days are already about 10 degrees warmer than we are here. We're topping out at around 65, and you're going to be up to about 75, at least maybe later in the week. But your nights are still down in the 40s. And that's very cold for tomatoes. And this year it has continued to be cold. I think last year was, by this time, was a little bit warmer. So my recommendation to people still at this point is to buy your little tomato plants and pop them into about a 1 gallon size container so that they can warm up during the day. The soil can get nice and warm. And then you can place them, say, against the house where they're going to get some protection from the cold during the night. And then if that's going to shade them during the day, put them back out in the sun during the day. And if you grow them that way for 3 or 4 weeks in the container, you'll get a head start over putting them in the ground or even in a large raised bed where the soil is never going to warm up even during the day. The daytime temperature may penetrate the top couple inches of soil at the most, and then these continued cold nights are going to keep that soil temperature down at a range that's a little too cool for them to really thrive. So I would say it's worth putting them into the 1 gallon container and growing them for a little while. Now, looking at these two, you might ask, what's the difference between these guys? This is like a tree, and this is a little skinny guy. The difference is that this is a Northern California grown tomato, grown in Sebastopol, I think, and then popped into the can just a little while ago here in Mill Valley. This was grown in Southern California and shipped up here, and that is the difference. On my phone, I've got my sister's house weather in Marina del Rey, and their nights are perfect for tomatoes. They're in the mid 50s. And this was probably grown in a greenhouse in Southern California. And so it got a great head start and then shipped up here. This one looks perfectly healthy and good. Sometimes you will see plants that have come up that way that are very long and light green and almost feel juicy, and they are going to have a little bit of a hard time adjusting to our weather here. So if you are buying tomato plants at a big box store or something like that, where they could be getting them from almost anywhere, keep an eye out for the ones that seem to be oversized for the container they're in, because those may have trouble adjusting both to the night and to the sun, because they've probably been protected from the sun, and that's why they are growing so strong like that. This little guy is going to be a dandy tomato, but will never, in its early months, be as stocky as the Southern California tomato, just because of the weather. Let's see. Now, we want to prepare our soil well, and if you're planting in the ground, what you're really doing is trying to build soil for your vegetable garden. And building soil means adding organic matter primarily. I like a combination of compost and manure, about 3 parts compost to 1 part manure. Local farm here in San Anselmo every year gets a bunch of cow manure from out in West Marin and spreads 2 or 3 inches of that on their farm fields and tills it in. And that's basically their preparation. But I think some leafy compost is very helpful, especially for plants like tomatoes that require a lot of micronutrients, not in large quantities, except maybe calcium. And leafy compost has a lot of micronutrients in it, more than the animal manure has. The other things that have a lot of micronutrients in them are kelp, which can be kelp meal or a liquid form of kelp. There's a liquid form here that you can water in. And there's a mineral called azomite, which this company Down to Earth packages, and you can get a little package of azomite, and it's a volcanic rock that's ground up and has most of the micronutrients in it that you'd ever need, and it's a good addition. One year, the public garden here put in some new beds, and they brought soil in that turned out to have almost no nutrition in it at all when they finally tested it. And so people came over, and I basically set them up with some compost, some manure, some azomite or kelp meal, and it turned out that the soil produced good vegetables after that, but the people that didn't amend it like that had a hard time. So it's important to get those things in there. It's also important tomatoes in particular to have a fairly high level of calcium. Tomatoes, peppers, and zucchini share the problem of called blossom end rot, which means that as the tomato grows and the flower falls off, if there's a lack of calcium, the end of the tomato where the flower was will form a kind of pale tan looking, almost like a blister. It's quite unattractive, and the part of the tomato that's close to it won't be good to eat. That's almost entirely lack of calcium. It can be exacerbated by inconsistent watering, but you'll find it often in tomatoes and often in zucchini squash. So get some calcium into the soil at the time of planting. That can be done either by a kind of general fertilizer. This is the E.D. Stone tomato vegetable food, which contains, if I read the ingredients, just like at the grocery store, it contains 3% calcium. And that's about the minimum we want in a general fertilizer for the tomatoes, 3% calcium. If you want to do it separately, oyster shell like this is an excellent way to get the calcium into the ground. You can also do it through dolomite lime. You can do it through, although bone meal doesn't specify, it's really a source of phosphorus. Bone meal will be helpful. Crushed eggshells do a job over time, not immediately. That calcium is not going to be available for quite a while until it decomposes. But we want to ensure fertility, and we want to ensure that there's at least decent drainage. In spite of my experience of growing in the wet bag, I don't recommend that. And if your soil, if you dig a little hole and fill it up with water and it doesn't drain within 24 hours, it's probably not going to be a very good spot for the tomatoes. We have a very, very high water table around here, and there are people who can dig down a foot in the winter and they'll have water in their garden. Fortunately, in the summer, it recedes and they can grow their tomatoes fine in the ground. But if you have a heavy clay layer or a hard pan into that won't allow it to drain, you're probably better off growing in raised beds than trying to fight with the lack of drainage.
Hey, Dan, I was gonna cut in for a second. That's okay. We actually have a lot of really good questions and topics based around the soil amendments and setting up your soil, and you're really going into it very well. And actually across the board, you're answering most of our questions pretty seamlessly as you kind of go through these care tips. So it's really nice. But a lot of people are asking, when you were mentioning growing stuff in the ground and using compost and the chicken manure, also using, like when you're growing in a pot or containers, do you tend to mix in those compost and chicken manures as well? Do you use just like a potting soil? How do you kind of set up the container versus like what you're setting up in the ground?
Right, great question. I do not use the compost and manure when I initially set up a pot with fresh potting soil. A good quality fresh potting soil will have plenty of nutritional elements in it. I'll be back in a second here. I'm going to read you some of the ingredients in this smoke potting soil. The base is just fir bark and peat moss, but then it's got earthworm castings, feather meal, bat guano, and kelp meal. Well, you get plenty of everything you need from the earthworm castings, feather meal, bat guano, and kelp meal for the first little while. And so what I add to the potting soil when I first plant is a general fertilizer, an organic fertilizer, which is going to take a little time to decompose and become available to the plant. And we'll take it through at least to the point where it has set fruit.
Okay.
So for a 2 cubic foot bag of potting soil in a container, I would put about 2 good-sized handfuls of a general balanced fertilizer.
I'm gonna zoom in because people want to.
Zooming in here on the,
Yeah, and the bag that he was showing a bit ago talking about the
Yeah.
ingredients is the organic potting soil,
Yeah.
Yeah.
the Slope brand.
this is the organic potting soil.
Yeah.
There are other premium potting soils, the E.B. Stone's Recipe 420, which is obviously marketed for growing marijuana, but happens to be excellent for growing tomatoes as well. Or the Fox Farm is an excellent brand, but very expensive. Also marketed for growing marijuana, but excellent for tomatoes. My own experience is they grow fine in the Slope Organic. The difference between the Slope Organic, for instance, and the Slope, what we call regular potting soil, is that the regular potting soil doesn't have as much fertility and it doesn't retain as much moisture. It's sandier. The organic potting soil happens to be just about the right texture for growing vegetables. And I can't think really of an exception. They all grow very well in it. So I tend to go with that, and the price point, frankly, is better than some of the other premium brands. But I would be a little bit careful if you buy brands that I would look at the ingredients and make sure they're not just sawdust, basically, or just bark and sand.
Definitely, you can almost feel it when you work with the soil. You can definitely feel the difference between some of the more quality soils. It's good to kind of feel your soil, definitely.
Right, and what the research has shown is that different sizes of particles are critical to a good potting soil. The people that grow plants in potting soil for a living, the people that produce all these plants, have done a lot of research, and it doesn't work to just have the same size chunks all through. So you need different materials in there to give you chunkier parts, finer parts, rockier parts, and the better potting soils will have all those ingredients.
Definitely. And when you're also planting in some people are talking about larger planter beds or larger planter boxes, and sometimes even also I'm wondering about multiple plants in those boxes. But in general, for amending your soil, is that something you want to go for more like the potting soils? You want to go for more like a planting soil mix, or what's your kind of thought process there?
Yeah, it gets tough to figure that out.
That's the gray area.
If you're growing in a raised bed, my own solution is to go with potting soil, to treat it as a container, which is really what it is. Even if it's open to the ground on the bottom, the plants for the most part are not going, if we have it up, say, waist high for ease of picking and cultivating and all that, or even a 2-foot one, the plants generally have their roots in about the top foot or so of the soil. And so even though they're not going to be using the whole thing, if you put different kinds of soils at different levels in these containers, the plants run into a barrier every time they get to one of those layers, and they retain different amounts of moisture and air. And in general, it's not a good idea to layer things when you're gardening. You want to mix things when you're gardening. So I tend to recommend potting soil for raised beds and planting mixes for mixing into the native soil. You can make your own potting soils or mixes for your raised beds. But if they have very much native soil in them, they're going to tend to pack and lose their tilth and drainage, and you're going to end up having to stir them a lot between crops. You can also buy bulk soil mixes, which tend to have a fair amount of native soil in them and of sort of unknown origin, usually from construction projects where they're selling off the topsoil to a soil company. And well, this is how the city got their soil for their public garden, and they ended up with a soil that wasn't worth much. So it's a tricky one. And you have to experiment, but you can't really go wrong with the potting soil.
Cool. That's what I've always kind of talked with people when I talk to them about tomatoes too, but it's always good getting some more opinions about that. I'm going to check back in as you probably get more into some of the other plants you have on your table, because I know people are interested in the companion gardening and planting them all. So I'll check back in after that, but thank you very much.
Very good. I do use compost and manure when I am redoing a plot that's finished with a crop. For instance, if I grown my zucchinis in a container and I'm finished with them and I take them out, it's the manure and compost elements that decompose during the season and give the nutrition to the plant. So I want to add more compost and manure and lighten up the mix by stirring it around, get air into it before I plant something in the fall there in the same container. Now with the tomatoes, by the way, I do not reuse the soil that I've grown tomatoes in a container. There are just too many soil-borne diseases that could be passed on to the next year's crop. And so I save that soil for something else, either ornamental plants or things that are not related to tomatoes. And that seems to work fine. And then I use fresh potting soil in my containers for the next year's crop. I want to talk a little bit about grafted tomatoes. They usually come something like this. There's a rootstock called Mighty Mato, which is, they've been around now for a number of years, but they seem to be getting more popular. The advantage to grafting is that you graft the tomato you want to eat. This is a brandywine, which is one of the best tasting tomatoes there is. But it's big and it's hard to grow here. You graft that onto the Mighty Mato rootstock, which is a tomato that's been developed to have a strong rootstock that is more temperature resistant and more disease resistant. And the hope is then that you can grow the bigger, later tomato on this stronger rootstock. And the feedback I've been getting is that they work very well for people. The difference is that you do not want roots growing out of the brandywine stem. You want the roots all coming from the rootstock, and it's the rootstock is sticking up above the soil level here about an inch. I don't know if you can see it, but the graft scar is right there. And you can see there's a little change in size. Yeah. And if I were to bury it up to here, then I'd get all kinds of roots growing out of the brandywine that's grafted on top of the rootstock. And I don't want that to happen because I want the rootstock to be the source of root growth for the plant. So in this case, I'm going to plant it with the graft scar up in the air where I can see it, and make sure that roots don't grow out of that stem, and they won't if it's up in the air. So grafted tomatoes cost about 3 times as much as a seed-grown tomato, but for the larger tomatoes, it might very well be worth your while to grow a Brandywine or a Cherokee Purple or a Black Crim. They tend to be the heirlooms that are grown on the rootstock. And if you've had success in the past with cherry tomatoes, then I would not recommend growing Sun Gold as a grafted plant because you can usually have good success without having to buy the grafted plant. Cherry tomatoes generally do well everywhere in the Bay Area, and there are many, many of them. Sun Gold is the orange one that is super sweet. Super Sweet 100, Sweet Million, Isis Candy, Chadwick Cherry, Matt's Wild Cherry. They're all wonderful cherries that you can grow successfully. And we don't need to spend a lot of time on those, except that they get big. And we do need to talk about how to support your tomato plants, because if you're growing the indeterminate type that grow on and on, you probably don't want them just laying on the ground. And it's not that they won't grow that way, they will, but the fruit will be on the ground, then it's more likely to be attacked by earwigs and sow bugs and things like that. And it's harder to find it and harder to pick it. So what I'm going to do is plant, no, that's an ace. I want to plant a stupice, which is one of the early kind of small slicers that's grown very successfully in the Bay Area, probably from Eastern Europe, and is a terrific early tomato of about 60 days that you will have success with everywhere. Always comes with a label, we hope, and you want to hang on to that. And we want to take it out of its container gently, and we can see that it's got a nice little root system that's grown out to the edge of the soil here, but it's not thick and compacted, and it's quite fresh. And I will tell you that stupice is one of the varieties that has what's called a potato leaf. And you can see the difference between the leaf on stupice, which is kind of big at the end, and what's called a tomato leaf tomato. This is another ace, but you will find that some of the varieties, stupice and Brandywine, are both potato leaf, and it just reminds you of the close relationship. If you had a potato plant here, the leaf would look quite similar to this stupice leaf. There's no significance to it other than that arcane fact. So I'm going to plant it in the big container, although in reality, I would want to plant this in the little container and grow it a little longer. But I want to do this because then I want to show you how the tomato cage works. So I use the handy tool that comes with the plant to just scratch up the root ball a little bit. I want to break those outside roots so that they have to branch and grow out into the new soil. And I also want to rough up the root ball a little bit so that there are more fissures and nooks and crannies to attach to the new soil here. And so I put this soil in here, and what I'm going to do is kind of dig a hole deeper than I need. And then I'm going to put some fertilizer in there. Fertilizer. Put a good big handful down in the hole.
That's the tomato
And
vegetable
this is the
food.
tomato vegetable food. Now I'm just going to put a little soil on top of that. Now, if I wanted to get fancy, and I do, because you're out there, this is mycorrhizal fertilizer. It's not very strong fertilizer, but it is full of mycorrhizal fungi. And they are fungi that make the interface between plant roots and the soil. And they do a lot of the work of breaking down the minerals in the soil and transferring them to the roots of the plant. We've learned, if you've ever read The Secret Life of Trees, you may have learned that a lot of the communication with plants and among plants happens with the help of mycorrhizal fungi. And so if you want to spend the cash, it's about $30 for a container like this, but you don't need very much at a time. And I'm convinced that it's helpful. And I took off the first few leaves so that they're not there.
Hey, Jen, I think the sound kind of cut out a little bit.
I'm sorry.
There you go.
Can you hear now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, so I'm going to be sure to put the label in so that I know what variety it is. And then I want to support it. So I'm going to use a tomato cage. This is a cage. What I'm going to do is bend the legs out a little bit so they're a little straight. And then just place it over the plant so that as the plant grows up, I'm going to make sure that it stays inside the rings as it grows up, and that will keep it up nice and straight. Now, in a container like this, I often stake the plant just to make sure I don't accidentally break it. And I love these 4-foot bamboo stakes that come in a package of about 20 and are real easy to cut with your ordinary shears. So I just stick one in the container and whack it off a little above the plant. Like so. And then tie it with twine or with tie tape, depending on what you have available to you. I like to make a little figure 8 around the stem of the plant and then just tie it to the stake. And that way, strong wind, or if I accidentally kick it over or my dog gets too friendly with it, it's not likely to break. And I would especially do that with the grafted tomatoes, because if it breaks at the graft, then you've lost it completely. Here at the nursery, I love to put a hang tag with the name of the plant on it, because sometimes we lose these little tags, and you can do this at home as well, or use something where you won't lose track of what you're growing, because I know it's frustrating for people. They'll come into the nursery and say, oh, I had this tomato last year and it was fantastic. What was it? I said, well, yeah, good question. What was it? What we can narrow it down by size and color, things like that, but we can't be sure what it was, because even if you're a member of the Slope Rewards program, that's not going to tell you what variety of tomato you bought last year. So keep track of that, and don't necessarily write the tomato off that you don't have success with, but certainly keep track of the ones that you do have success with, because that's probably a tomato that works well in your particular microclimate. And your microclimate is unique. It's different than your neighbors across the street and or next door. your particular deck or balcony where you might grow these is different than anybody else's. So, you have to be the student of your microclimate. Want to make a little shout out for flowers to grow with your vegetables. These happen to all be edible flowers. These are all organically grown. Violas are very tasty and colorful in your salads. Nasturtiums give a little tang. You usually eat the buds of those, kind of like capers. These are dianthus, which are like little carnations and quite sweet and edible as well. And they will all attract pollinators for your garden, and you should grow other flowers to attract the pollinators, like cosmos are one of the best summer flowers for attracting bees to your garden, which are necessary, although tomatoes will fertilize themselves even without bees in most situations. Let's see, I want to save time here for particular questions. So why don't we do that?
Yeah. We actually have a lot of really great questions, like I was saying, and you've been going through a bunch of them. But while we're actually on the topic of the flowers, it's probably one of the bigger topics, or that everyone is kind of wondering about. Lots of different questions on how far can you place the flowers to the plants? Can you grow tomatoes with other plants, like you're just mentioning, which definitely can, but just a little more info about that. Some people were asking about some flowers that are used to deter pests. I know marigolds is one that we always kind of bring up, and stuff like that. So everyone has their own opinions on all those. So do you have any for your kind of flower needs?
Right. Tomatoes traditionally are grown with onions. I think there is some feeling that the onions fend off some of the insects. Marigolds really only fend off soil nematodes, which we don't have bad soil nematodes here. I would recommend, if you can find them, getting single marigolds that have obvious pollen that you can touch. They'll be more attractive to insects than the big double marigolds, which don't have anything for them to eat. Flowers that are relatively simple and flat and that have a yellow center mean that you are looking at the pollen, and that's what the insects are after, a combination of pollen and nectar. I recommend flowers both for eating, for decoration, and to attract pollinators. And unfortunately, at least in my research, you can find recommendations on companion planting that are just 100% opposite from each other. And so I would say experiment. Onions and tomatoes apparently have been grown together for hundreds of years successfully. So that's certainly one that I would try. Herbs nearby are also helpful. Thyme has beautiful little flowers that will attract pollinators. And all of the sage family, from the ornamental salvias to the culinary sage, if you let some of that go to flower as well, that will attract not only bees, but butterflies and hummingbirds to your garden. So that's a wonderful.
Definitely. Yeah, and no, I just wanted to also, everyone who has questions around these other companion plants or bringing in pollinators or good bugs and stuff, like I mentioned at the beginning, we actually have 2 seminars coming up that are all about that kind of topic. So definitely tune in next week and the week after for good bugs and companion planting and other flowers and bringing pollinators, because that's definitely a big topic that has its own whole range of questions and stuff around it. And yeah, I've planted some herbs, I planted some flowers around my tomatoes, and And yes, the tomato does end up filling up the pot that it's in usually. So you have to be careful of how much you pack in there, but it seems like they do okay with a few plants inside the pots nearby, right?
Yeah, it won't hurt the tomatoes. It'll be more of a struggle for the other.
Yeah.
The tomatoes will tend to shade them out and over compete for the nutrition and the water. But it certainly won't hurt the tomatoes. Let's put it that.
I want to say that I did put a link in with the email that everyone should have got for a resource handout on companion planting from our website. So you should have that link on there too.
Yeah. And then another question that is leading in from what you just said, the watering aspect. And I know you've talked a fair bit about different kinds of watering and stuff, but a lot of people have questions on, the question's always, how much do I water this plant? Which is a very complicated question because a lot of things go into that. But generally, what are some tips about watering your tomatoes, or during different parts of the season? Do you have to do more or less, stuff like that?
Right. As time goes on, you have to do more. Is the short answer for that. And when the tomatoes are first planted, especially, for instance, a small plant that I just planted there in a large container, the watering will be fairly minimal because I don't want it sitting in a big soggy bunch of soil that will take 10 days to dry out. So I'm gonna water right around the stem and root area. Maybe I might be able to do it as little as twice a week. I'd have to keep an eye on it. But it certainly will be around that range, about twice a week. And then as it grows into the soil, I'll be watering more quantity each time I water, and hopefully be able to stay at that about twice a week until it has started to fill up the container. And then I'm going to have to water more often. And as the summer goes on, by the mid part of summer, I'll be watering at least every other day, and during heat waves, probably every day.
Yeah.
So it varies, and it'll vary with your exposure, how much wind you get. Wind can dry things out very quickly. What kind of container you're in. Plastic doesn't dry out as fast as terracotta, for instance. Terracotta actually breathes through the clay, and so it dries out quite quickly. So it's the finger, this digit is your best water meter. Use it, stick it down in the soil. If it's cool and moist down there, you probably don't have to water. If it's dry, a finger depth, then it's probably time to water. In the ground, you want to water thoroughly, deep soak, and then try to keep yourself from watering again. You should try at the beginning, you should try to go a week before you water again. That will encourage the roots to go down to find the water, and you'll get a nice deep rooted plant. If you just water shallowly at the surface, you will be training the plant to need watering every day. And
Definitely.
You don't want that. Right.
And I know also that sometimes being careful of what time of the day you water. I mean, you can definitely water whenever the plant needs it, but I know that sometimes watering at nighttime can help it really take up the water, or hold it for a little bit longer if you're struggling for it to kind of retain the water. But I water mine at all times.
Yeah, I tend to be a little careful about night watering, particularly with plants that are subject to fungal diseases. I prefer water in the morning so that by evening the leaves are dry and the surface of the soil even is dry. And I try to avoid splashing water from the soil up onto the leaves. And I don't water the foliage of tomatoes.
Yes.
So, but watering in the heat of the day is generally not a good idea. You're going to get a lot more evaporation. Plus, the plant is probably, just because of the heat, not going to be able to use the water very well. And sometimes you get what's called heat wilt, where the soil's wet and your plant wilts anyway. It doesn't happen quite so much with tomatoes, but you'll certainly see it with your zucchini and other large leafed plants. And be sure not to water during the day if that's happening. All you'll be doing is expelling air out of the soil, and water will take its place, and the roots will be even less able to bring water up to the plant. What you can tell it's day heat wilt, because in the evening, the plant will perk right back up again. And so it's got enough moisture in the soil, it just doesn't have the ability to get it up to the leaves and keep them turgid during the heat of the day. So that's kind of important, not to water a plant that's going through that. If it's wilting because of lack of water, the soil is dry, then you can water at any time, and it should be able to absorb some and come back.
Yeah, and actually you were leading into one of my next questions was, when you are watering, being careful watering your leaves. It's mostly because of a powdery mildew issue and other kind of fungal issues. And some people are wondering maybe some other tips about what they do to deal with that, or if there's something they can do for powdery mildew and other ones like that.
Yes, fungal diseases, powdery mildew is the least of the fungal problems with. They have some really serious fungal problems, and those include verticillium wilt and fusarium wilt, which are both soil-borne, and also early and late blight, which are at first anyway airborne. I recommend one or the other of the bacterial fungicides. These are relatively new. The other brand is called Actinovate, and these are a fairly broad spectrum natural fungicide. They're listed for organic gardening, and you can use them prophylactically if you want to help prevent fungal diseases, and you can certainly use them if you see the most common symptoms of most of the dangerous funguses are brown spots on the leaves, kind of irregular, that usually start lower on the plant and work their way up. And those you want to pay attention to and use the fungicide. Sometimes it's some farmers recommend compost tea drenches, and there may be something to that, because that would be full of different kinds of fungus and bacteria, which might have some natural fungus fighters in them. It kind of goes against the idea of getting the foliage wet, but there is at least anecdotal evidence that it works. If you go, I have a website listed here on the outline, which is growbetterveggies.com, which is a farm down in the SoCal area, I think it is. And they have an elaborate recipe for planting tomatoes, which you'll get a kick out of. You don't have to follow it. It involves fish heads and eggshells and all kinds of things. But they also recommend the compost tea drenches as just a regular prophylactic. So it might be worth a try on one of the plants to see if it has any effect. But this Monterey Complete, oh, this is the VT, I'm sorry, I've got the wrong one here. This is Bacillus thuringiensis, which is very helpful for the big tomato hornworms that can attack your plant and eat your tomatoes. They're gigantic caterpillars, very pretty, but kind of scary when you run into one. And the BT will keep them off of there. But that's Yeah. But the same company, Monterey, makes their complete what is it called?
Complete disease control, I believe.
Yeah, complete disease control, and that's the bacterial fungicide, which is quite effective, and I would certainly recommend that. Although, you know, the reality is that most of us get through the season with most of our plants surviving. And if you have a plant that weakens and just isn't looking healthy and isn't growing well, just take it out. I mean, that's your best bet. Don't fight it. Get rid of it. Put it in the green can. Don't compost it at home. The green can professional composters the heat will kill the pathogens, but your compost at home probably won't. And you know, get a new plant. It's still early in the season. Plants will be available till June anyway, and the weather will only get better for the tomatoes. It's unfortunate in the way the market works. People want to buy the tomatoes early. We get them in early. We sell them to you early, and then the number of varieties and the freshness of the tomatoes tends to decrease at the garden centers as time goes on, even though if you planted in up to mid-June, you would have plenty of time to grow lots of tomatoes with our long season. We keep having tomatoes well into October and sometimes November around here. So it's just the way the world works. The best selection is going to be for about the next month. And so get your tomatoes, put them in a little larger container, grow them for a couple, 3 weeks, and then put them in your ultimate container in the ground or in your raised bed, and you'll probably have good success.
Yeah, and it is really important to talk about, like, the length of the season is a little bit longer. Some of my staff at our San Francisco store talk about how they can plant their tomatoes even very late into the season because we have such a warm kind of fall period in that area, so that the tomatoes actually ripen very well in like that fall kind of period, even though we get these tomatoes so early in like February or March, which is definitely on the very early side. And some people have successes, but it's always good to kind of think about that and think about when you're growing and where you're growing.
Well, when you all get more sophisticated and are starting your own tomatoes from seed and trading your seeds back and forth with your neighbors, because you've got your good neighborhood tomatoes, then you can grow them a little later because you'll be growing them yourself. In most of Mexico and Central America, every little region will have its own peppers and its own tomatoes. This is it's a phenomenon where people trade seeds back and forth, and they tend to end up growing the plants that grow best in their region and that they've adopted into their cuisine. And you know, if we all did that in our neighborhoods, we could have the same kind of thing and say, well, this one's going to be called the Ridgeway Avenue tomato, because that's the one we all grow on Ridgeway Avenue. But we don't do that right now. I have a few questions, if this is a good time, that came in by email, which I'll answer kind of quickly if that works. One of them is, will raccoons pick and eat tomatoes? Generally, no. They don't, but rats love tomatoes, so be careful.
Yeah.
I only have space to grow one tomato in a container. What's a suitable variety? Well, again, if it's a large container, you can grow almost any variety. If you're going to grow one tomato, I recommend a cherry, and I usually tell people to start with sun gold, because it is just hard to resist.
My favorite one, yeah.
I will tell you that tomatoes that are yellow or orange are less acidic in general than the red tomatoes. Sometimes they may taste a little blander because of the lack of acidity, but they can have good tomato flavor. They don't have the lycopene in them that turns them red, so you don't get the antioxidants. But sun gold is hard to resist. I've been growing tomatoes from seeds indoors over winter. They're ready to go outside. How do I do this, basically? How do I move them from inside to outside? Well, the way to do that is to move them outside into a shaded area during the day and then move them back inside at night for about a week. Then move them into the outside area and leave them out there at night, and then slowly ease them into the sun. If you put them immediately from inside into the sun, they will sunburn. And where sunburn on us is red, sunburn on tomatoes is white, and it will bleach the chlorophyll right out of the leaves, and you will end up with a bunch of white leaves. It usually won't kill them, but it'll set them back considerably, and they'll have to grow out new leaves to replace those, which is in a sense a waste of time for them. They had perfectly good leaves, and if we ease them into the sun a few hours at a time, they can learn to live in the sun just fine. So gently ease them out into full sun. A couple of my plants are growing from, producing from last year. Should I keep them? Yeah, keep them. Now, you do need to be able to distinguish between plants that have kept growing from last year and seedlings that have grown from tomatoes that have fallen on the ground. If they fell from an open pollinated plant, you'll get that same plant again. If it was from a hybrid, or if it hybridized during the season, you will get something very different, which may not be very productive or may not be very edible. So most of these volunteer viney little tomatoes that pop up in our compost pile or whatever are not going to make good tomatoes and aren't worth wasting your time on. Second part of the question, I had blossom rot on some of my tomatoes and squash. Calcium, calcium, calcium. There is a foliar spray called Foli-Cal. I think it's also made by Monterey, which you can spray on the foliage and get quick uptake of the calcium. So if you weren't able to get it into the ground to begin with, and you've got some blossom end rot, get the Foli-Cal and spray that on, and that will help you solve that problem. Alrighty. Couple more questions here if I can find them.
I do want to remind everyone, because I see people are asking, is that the recording of this will be available by Tuesday. And so, you know, you'll be able to fast forward and rewind and pause and whatnot and go back over all this really valuable information.
Somebody asked about Epsom salts. Should I put Epsom salts on my tomatoes? It won't hurt. But Epsom salts provides magnesium and some acidity. It's hydrated magnesium sulfate, I think. You probably don't have a magnesium deficiency. If you've been using compost at all, or a good quality potting soil with a general fertilizer, you have plenty of magnesium. But it won't hurt. What you have to be careful of is that you don't mistake Epsom salts, magnesium sulfate, for for magnesium bath salts, which is magnesium chloride. And that will put salt into the soil that will probably kill your plants. So make sure it's Epsom salts, or better yet, this is Sulfo-Mag, which is the sulfur and the magnesium that Epsom salts has, plus potassium, which we know plants always need. And so give them something they need. And if they happen to need those, fine. But in general, a balanced fertilizer and plenty of compost will provide all of the nutrition that your plants need.
For the Sulfo-Mag, do you put that into the soil? Do you put the Sulfo-Mag into the soil when you're planting, or is it later in the season? Like that kind of stuff.
Time of planting is the most effective.
Okay.
Yeah, you can sprinkle it on top, scratch it in and water it in, but it will be more effective if it's down in the soil. And that goes for any of the dry fertilizers are best used at the time of planting. Later in the season, I tend to go with a soluble fertilizer.
Yeah, I do too.
Because it actually takes biological action, fungi and bacteria, breaking this down to make it available. And if it's just laying on top of the soil, it really doesn't have a chance to do that. So one of the soluble kelp fertilizers or the fish emulsion type fertilizers work great for getting it down into the soil after by midsummer in my tomato bins, the soil is pretty compact and it's pretty full of roots. So it's not like you can dig around in there easily.
Yeah.
It's hard to get down there. So a liquid fertilizer is very helpful.
Do you use more of a bloom food later in the season? I've usually heard that for tomatoes, it's like a lot more of the bloom food for growing them later.
I don't. You can do that. I think if you've got plenty of flowers, and I usually do, there's no reason to think you need to, encourage the plant to make more flowers. It's basically what they want to do.
Yeah.
The plant's goal in life is to procreate, and the way it does that is by making flowers and fruit. So it's to our benefit, but it won't hurt to use the lower nitrogen, higher phosphorus and potash fertilizers, a 0-10-10 type of thing later in the season. But with an indeterminate tomato, you need it to keep growing, and so it continues to need nitrogen throughout the season.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in my book, that's one of those, it won't hurt, but I don't go that way.
All righty. Well, I think we've gone through a lot of different kinds of topics here. I hope everyone's feeling a lot better about their tomato growing. I am definitely. I usually plant mine within the next week or so in this month. So I'm excited to get my cherry tomatoes probably going here in the city. I do better with the cherry tomatoes than any of the other ones. But thank you so much, Dan, for going through all these kind of topics and all these information. And thank you, Jen, for filming everything. I hope everyone's having a great Saturday and gets outside and enjoys the sun. And any last kind of words you want to give out there?
Been a great pleasure to talk to you, and ask any of your local garden centers for help on your particular area. They're going to know your climate, your little differences in climate better than somebody far away. So talk to them and talk to your neighbors, see what they've been growing successfully, and away you go. Don't be afraid.
Yeah, and thank you everyone in the chat for all the kind words and good questions. So,
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.